Thank you, brother, and thank you to everyone there in Liberia and surrounding countries that receive the broadcast for tuning into the station this Sunday evening. God bless you, and I ask you to pray for me as I continue to try to preach to you, that the Lord may bless us both. Continuing our study of the book of Genesis, this is the second sermon, and we will begin in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 6. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. I'll end the reading there and try to preach on this. Now, last week, in the sermon, I tried to make it clear, even though I know my preaching isn't clear like it ought to be, that I don't believe what so-called science teaches people today, in so much that they teach that the earth is hundreds of millions of years old and the universe billions of years old. I don't believe it for a minute. I don't think the fossil record supports that. I don't believe the realities that are involved in the complexity of both human and animal life support any theory that would suggest that it evolved from a lower form to a higher, regardless of how much time they want to throw at that, to make it so by chance, as though chance can cause something. It's obvious to any honest mind that creation is a created thing. And I believe the account given to us in Scripture that it was God that created it. And I believe He created it precisely like He said. I believe He created it in 6 days. I believe that those 6 days were 24-hour days, even though the first 3 were before the sun was made. And yet there was light in the first day, and it was divided from darkness in the first day. And I believe that these were days in the normal sense of the word. It is exactly what the word in Hebrew means. It is provided for day as the same word that means day as it is today. They weren't millions of year days. They were hours in length, just like now. I'm not going to keep repeating that. I cannot prove that to someone that doesn't believe in God, or someone who claims to believe in God but doesn't believe what He wrote about the history of the world. But it is clear that here in Genesis, God is claiming through the writer, who was Moses, that He created the world in 6 days. Period. He tells how He created it, what He created, the sequence of events whereby He created. There was an order to it. I'm not sure I understand the order, but knowing God, it was orderly and it was needful. Why did He take 6 days when He could have done it at a blink? There's a lot of conjecture about that. But I will say this, that as most things were created for our good, so was the 7-day week, whereby we rest on 1 day out of the week. Whereas we can get years based upon the sun's or the earth's rotation around the sun, and we can get months by the moon's rotation about the earth. The only concept of a week comes from Scripture. There is nothing else. I mean, why divide time by 7-day segments? The reason is because God so ordered it, because He created it. It is, whether we want to admit it or not, God set it into the very fabric of the creation that he made in 6 days and rested on the seventh to show us that we should do the same thing. And we know that that is true. And if any person believing themselves to be a Christian and yet doubting that the world was made in 6 days, they need to turn to Exodus chapter 20. Excuse me. And let's read where he commands the children of Israel to observe the Sabbath. He says, Exodus chapter 20, verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, meaning set apart. There's one day in the week that is set apart from all other days. Then he says in verse 9, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. Remembering that, of course, he did his work in 6 days, and he gives himself a day to rest. Then in verse 10, he says, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God, the day that he rested. In it thou shalt do no work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor the stranger that is within thy gates. And then he tells us why, and this is what's key to our discussion in Genesis 1. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore, or because of this, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. I don't think that it tells us in any other one of those 10 commandments why it is that we are, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images. It doesn't give reasons for those, but for this one, for the day of rest once a week, he says, it's because God worked 6 days and rested on the seventh, you will do the same thing. Now that's the Bible verifying the Bible, and that's good enough for me. And I'm going to try to cease defending what the Scripture says about itself and about the origin of man and the origin of this world and the origin of all things that are natural. They were created by that which is above or supernatural. They were created by God. They are a creature of God. He set them in order to accomplish his will. When he decides to destroy them, they shall perish. And that day is coming. And we should be ready for that day. Because it'll come. It says, like a thief in the night. When you're not expecting it, that's when it will happen. And if it doesn't happen in your lifetime here on earth, it will certainly happen for you at your death. So we need to be ready, and we need to pay attention to what God says about creation and other things. And we should not lean to our own understanding, nor that of other men who, despite the degrees that they tack on to the end of their names, they were not there when God created the heavens and the earth. And whatever they want to conjecture about it, if it is at odds with what is written in this book, it is wrong. And enough said on that. So in verse 6 of chapter 1, God says, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it, that firmament, divide the waters from the waters. Now that's confusing. And I think one of the reasons it is confusing is because this is the only place where we have any specific reference to it. And in my opinion, that firmament, well, the firmament is still there. But the division of waters above and below it, I think that division is gone. And I'll try to explain what I mean. It is, and I confess at the outset, I'm like all other men. I have no absolute knowledge of where the waters that were above were at one time and the waters that were below and how the firmament separated them. There's no pictures of it. There's no drawings of it. It's not in human, passed down stories. Because everyone that saw that, I believe, everyone that saw that firmament either died before the flood came or died in the flood. Because I believe that firmament that was above the waters is what came down when it says, and God opened the windows of heaven so that the waters fell to the earth, and that he opened the fountains of the deep. I believe those waters is what constituted Noah's flood. And that the world that then was no longer exists. Peter says it perished. The world described here in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 no longer exists in the form that God made it. It perished along with its inhabitants except 8 people that were aboard the ark. Everything has changed since the creation of the earth, as far as the earth itself is concerned. So we have to take this from a standpoint of, well, I would say guessing. It certainly is a guess on my part, but I think that there are scriptures that lead to no other real honest conclusion than what I'm going to try to tell you about it. So understand, I told you last week, if you heard the sermon, that verse 1 is key in so much that it says, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. So he says heaven, singular. Now later on, he discusses heavens and earth. And when you read throughout the Bible, it's almost always heavens and earth, with the exception perhaps of this first chapter. Or when the Lord is talking about a heaven as though the place where he dwells, and not of a natural created place. But here we're talking about creation. So when it says in verse 1 that God created the earth and then he created the heaven, it's 2 singular things. There was nothing else other than God that was natural on that day, meaning of nature. So there was a heaven and an earth. And the word heaven there, used in the Hebrew, is a word that means an expanse or an expanding. I know you've heard the scientists talk about an expanding universe. And there is evidence, it would appear, of an expanding universe. But all that does is support what God said. He created the expanding. But we would call that space. And if you are scientific at all, and if you've dealt with the sciences in your job as I have, you begin to get an appreciation for matter and for what we call the atomic theory, the things that are that could be touched, if you will, versus the energy that cannot. So matter and energy is distinct from space. Now the word means an expanding, or maybe more comfortable to us because we can't hardly conceive of something constantly growing, particularly considered the vastness of it. But think of the firmament, the expanse, as being all nature, all the natural order that exists off of this planet. Okay? What we would call space. So think of the heaven, which he later calls the firmament that he created. He calls it heaven. And it is in the heaven that many more things are created. We'll learn later on that he set lights to govern day and night. A greater light for the day and a lesser light for the night, meaning sun and moon. He says he created the stars also. And amongst the stars are things that we perceive from Earth to be a star, and in many cases, it's a galaxy of stars. It is vast. It is to us, it's an inconceivably vast expanse. The heaven, in terms of dimension, is beyond our ken. We cannot know it. It's like trying to understand eternity or infinity, even though I believe there is a limit to space. He has set the bounds of it, like he set the bounds of the sea, where he says, go thus far and no further to the waves. He controls things, and there's divisions between things, and all of the created order is something that God made for himself, but it does not include himself. He is outside of it, though he works in it. He is not subject to its laws. He is not bound by its times. It is just a thing that he made, as glorious as it is, and as critical to us as it is. It's a creature of God. So now, there was a world made, and it talked about the waters, that the Spirit of God brooded over the face of the waters, and the earth was without form, and it was void or empty. It was formless, and it was empty, and there were waters covering the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God brooded or hovered or contemplated that which he created, which was the world, as distinct from the expanse. And I think I mentioned last week that he looked, no doubt, into it and made sure that all the elements of the earth that were needed for the duration of the earth, however long that will be, were present in what he would made and in the form that he intended them to be at the time. So it was formless, but it was full. Every tree that is existing today, the elements that ultimately made that tree were in that formless mass. There were no definitive structures of creation, but the raw materials for the world were there. And then, having made the world, the watery world, if you will, and the expanse on day one, and created a light, which I think was God himself emitting visible light. He's done it before. We read of it. It's enough light to light the new world by itself. But he later sets celestial bodies in place to govern day and night and to be for seasons and times and all that. He's done with making new things. Now he creates form after this. So from the world and the expanse or space, he begins to form them into a particular order that we cannot see it today because it perished in the flood, but yet the remnants of that world is what we see all around us. In the form of that world, having been changed, we see the changed form. So, now trying to explain a firmament that he said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And he talks about there being waters under the firmament and waters above the firmament. So he had created the earth, and it was covered in water. There was a lot of water. And then he made another expanse, or he just made a separation between water and water. So he took water and put a gap, if you will, between that which was above us, above the planet, and the waters that were upon the planet. They were all upon the planet on day one. But on day two, he separates waters from waters so that surrounding the planet, we don't know the distance, it does not say. But I would say that it probably was somewhere at a point of orbit, somewhere above atmosphere. Otherwise, there would be interactions between the atmosphere and whatever this was. A canopy, a sphere, a hollow sphere of water held in place by God. Now you could say, how does God hold a sphere of water in space that completely encapsulates the planet? Well, you might as well ask yourself, how does he keep the rings of Saturn in place? How does he do that? They're magnificent, but yet they are perfectly in order, and he holds them there. Scientists would say by gravimetric forces being balanced against the pull of other celestial bodies, and maybe that's how he holds it. But he says he upholds all things by the word of his power. If he said, let there be a sphere of water separated from the earth that is within that sphere by an expanse, it happens because he said it. If he could, when there was nothing, and he says, let the heaven and the earth exist, and they did, from nothing, surely he could take that which he had created and said, I'm going to modify that, such that there is a sphere of water enveloping the entire earth with an atmosphere, a sky, if you will, between it and the surface of the world. And then he says, so let there be a firmament, and that's what we would call, let's just call it, for simplicity's sake, it may be that it was the atmosphere that we now breathe, the sky in which we see birds fly and airplanes fly and balloons go up. You know, it's got atmosphere, something absolutely necessary to us in it. Nowadays, there's clouds there. But in the past, it was not so. We have to read further into Genesis to understand, but briefly, I'll just say that there was no rain on the earth until the flood. The ground, it says the water just came up out of the ground as a mist. It was as though the world was a terrarium or something. You know, it was just encapsulated, like a terrarium is encapsulated by glass. The world was encapsulated by water, and it was moist enough where, like dew, would just rise up from the ground, and it would be enough water for all the creatures and the plants that lived on it. It was a different world, but it's gone. So in that world, he made a gap between, he took some of the waters that were covering the earth and spread them out to a sphere around the world, kept from the world with an atmospheric gap between them, which he called also a firmament. It was the firmament that's in the midst of the waters. The waters, like what we see today, is the oceans, and that sphere of water which encircled the earth and encapsulated it once upon a time. And it divided those waters from the waters. He didn't create the waters on day two. They were already created. They were already in that formless and void mass that the Spirit of God brooded over and moved over and inspected and made sure it was perfect. Day two, he changes it to the point where he separates some waters out to encapsulate the earth. That's the best I can understand. And it says, and God made the firmament. Now we know he made it on day one. He created it then. But the firmament that he's talking about here that he made was the gap, the space or the expanse between the waters under and the waters over. So he made the firmament and divided the waters which are under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. So having created an expanse and having created a world, then he modified the world by putting an intermediate expanse, a small one, between the surface of the world's waters, and the waters that were in space surrounding the world. And then he says in verse 8, and God called the firmament, and it doesn't say which, and I think that's important. And God called the firmament heaven. So it's all right for us to discuss that firmament, that expanse, as heaven. But it's not the heaven where God dwells. That's also spoken of as heaven, but it's a different word. It's not the same word that means expanding or expanse. He called the created expanse heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. That's really all that's said there. But I want us to think about one thing in particular that we do not find in this account. We do not find on the second day that the Lord saw the works that he had done and pronounced them good. On day one, he said he looked at everything. He created the light and darkness. He looked at it, he said, it was good. I'll find it for you. And God saw the light, verse 4, that it was good. And then if you look at day 3, at the end of the creation of day 3, it says, and God saw that it was good. And evening and morning were the third day. On the fourth day, at the end of that, he had made the celestial bodies and the lights to rule the night and the day. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. The fifth day, the same thing. He pronounces it good. And on the sixth day, he pronounces it good. But on day 2, he does not pronounce it good. Why not? What is bad? What is not desirable? What is not good about day 2? I can only speculate. I'm not saying that there was a defect in it, but I think we would call it today, there was a necessary evil built into it. It was good in so much that the sphere of water that encapsulated the earth above the firmament that separated it from the surface of the planet, that thing would have shielded mankind from the harmful effects of radiation from the sun that we know today is the fundamental cause of aging of humans. Another benefit it would have had is that keeping the earth encapsulated that way, the weather would have been presumably constant all the time over the face of the earth. That there was no rain, there were no clouds, there was no, we don't read of any clouds or anything like that that even existed at that time. But nor were there continents at this time. I don't believe that it talks about, and when we get into the, how he calls the dry land to appear, he does not mention that being segregated by and separated by water. We know that in the New World it says there is no more sea. There is no more separation, a land separation, or pieces of land separated by other pieces of land by a sea. So, in the old world, I believe that when he calls the dry land to appear and be separate from the water, I think it was one continent of land, one vast continent. It was not as big as the sea that surrounded it, but it was big, bigger than any continent we have today. I believe that given that canopy of water that encapsulated the world, the earth was continuously kept at a perfect state of moisture for agriculture and all that. There was no weather to contend with in the world to come. But what was bad with that? Why would that be a bad thing? Well, I can tell you one thing. God knew before he created the world that man would sin. We read that Christ was a lamb slain from the foundation of the world. It means before. It talks about the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, where the triune God determined that which would be needed to save man from their sins. And it was by that determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God that Christ was delivered up to death for our sins, to pay the price for our sins. Before the world was, this happened. So God knew that he would create man, not in a state of sin, but man would voluntarily sin and thus curse the world. And yet he had made a world that was provided so that men could live without dying. Man brought death into the world, not God, but God knew that he would. And because of that, we have people like Noah that lived, Adam that lived 950 years, Methuselah that lived 969 years or something like that, nearly 1,000 years. Most of those people lived to great ages. Noah himself was 600 years old when the flood started. He lived, I think, another 300 years after that. And you say, perhaps, what's wrong with that? Why isn't that good? Well, we find the answer for that in the account of the flood. You know, that which is corrupt continues to be corrupted, and its corruption gets worse over time unless something stops it. And that's the case of human beings that are sinful. The world had become sinful. And in Genesis chapter 6, it tells about all that sin and how the sons of God looked upon the daughters of men and took unto them that they were fair. They took unto them wives of all that they wanted, and they had offspring by them. I believe truly that talked about angels that left their first estate and had offspring through human women. Others think differently. But it produced giants, whatever it was. There were giants in the earth in those days, mighty men of renown. And it says, and God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The longer people live, the more sin they commit. The longer they live, the more mischief they create. The longer they live, the more progeny they have that will be sinful. The longer they live, the worse things become. There's another place where he talks about that the world was filled with violence. It says in chapter 11, the earth also was corrupt before God. The earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, meaning through flesh and blood people, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So the canopy, created for the good of man, and it was good for him in that it prolonged his life and stabilized weather patterns and was productive for the growing of things that man needed for food. At that time, animals were not given to men for food. Whether the lost people used it, I don't know, but it was not given to them until after the flood. The meat of animals was given to us to eat after the flood. Why? I don't know. But they all were vegetarians, I guess, before the flood, because the world brought forth so abundantly food, you'd think that was a good thing. But that sphere of water, which was divided from the waters of the planet by an expanse, or our atmosphere, it was short-lived. The world was destroyed some 1,500 years or a little bit more after it was created. And it talks about that destruction, that when it came, it's in Genesis chapter 6, verse 11. Noah had, entered the ark. It says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up. I believe that was fountains of lava coming up, and that it caused continental drift, which separated the continent, in the world, which was one continent, into all the continents that we have now. And they continue to move, but at a slower pace from each other. Because all the fountains of the deep to be broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. The windows of heaven. In other words, all of a sudden rain came down in a deluge upon the world. And in verse 12 it says, and the rain was upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. In the self-same day that Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons, entered the ark, they and every beast, and all that. And it talks about the waters. Here in verse 17 it says, the flood was upon the earth for 40 days. The waters increased. They bear up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth. Where are you going to get enough water to completely cover all the earth? It says the great mountains were covered. It says, verse 18, the waters prevailed. They increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. The waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward, that's about 45 feet. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevailed, and all the mountains were covered, and all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both fowl and cattle and beast, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man, in all whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, died. So, knowing these things in advance, when God on day 2 created a firmament to separate waters from waters, it was a beneficial thing, but he knew that one day it would come tumbling down because of sin, and that the greatest catastrophe this world has ever experienced, or ever will until the last one, in which all flesh, man and animal, perished. They all died. All of them. The world itself perished. What emerged was something other than what was there, something lesser, something less ordered, more chaotic, and a world in which people lived shorter and shorter lives for a long time. Finally reached a point where we are, God said, that our days shall be, and this is on an average, 70 years. And is it not so? And it says, if by reason of strength, if you're particularly strong and in good health, you get 80. You get 80. He's limited how long we live because of sin. He saw how bad sin got in people that lived 1,000 years, and he says, I'm going to stop it. And the way that I'm going to punish these people, it'll also punish the world, and I'm going to flood it. And the waters that he brought down. And you can say, well, what happened to them? Did they go back into space? Well, a few did, and still do. It evaporates now. It becomes clouds. But I think the vast majority of the waters that had been separated from the waters on the surface by the firmament that separated it from the waters above the firmament, I think they're still covering the world, so that our landmass is even smaller in proportion to the water. In other words, the first single continent that God created had more landmass than what we have today. And waters today cover more of the globe's surface than they did before the flood, because they're still down here. And they have become salt in those oceans. They evaporate and produce fresh water, but there's a limited process there. So we still have, to this day, droughts, which cause famines, that cause fires, which we have deserts. I mean, the world was different. And so why did he not call it good? Because he knew in his mind that sphere of water separated by the firmament created or made to exist on the second day was not durable, and that it was going to work for the destruction of mankind, even though it had been created originally as a blessing for them. And that's my thoughts on it. I don't know that I have to explain why the second day was not pronounced good. But God, who knows the end from the beginning, has to wonder. I mean, you have to wonder if in his heart, and you understand that he loves mankind. He loves it so much that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him would not perish, which is our destiny, but rather have eternal life. It grieved him. It says in there, Genesis chapter 6, it grieved God in his heart, and it repented him that he had made man. He knew it would happen, but somehow the experience of seeing the sin and the violence and knowing the thoughts of every heart, because that's where he looks. He looks on the heart of man. He knows every thought and every intent, every plan, every scheme, everything that we all think all the time. And he has all this on a world that had gone mad with sin, lives nearly 1,000 years old that were sinning the whole time and improving upon their sin, making it more and more evil all the time. And he's saying, this canopy allows lives of that longevity. When I destroy this world for its sin, I'll use that canopy. I think maybe that's why he did not declare it good, because there was a not so favorable aspect to its existence, in that it would be the weapon he used to destroy the world. And we have to think, he said, that same world that was destroyed by water back in the flood, we'll read this in the book of 2 Peter, he says that's kept in store by the same word, meaning by Christ, against the day of judgment, where he will destroy the world, this time not by water, but by fire. Where does that fire come from? Have you ever asked yourself that? Does it come down out of heaven? Maybe. It could. Could he bring some fiery orb from space and smack us? Could it come up from the earth? I mean, those of us who have lived around the ring of fire, so-called, what we call the Pacific Rim in our country, where I lived in Alaska for so long, and we see volcanoes, and we see what comes out of them, and it's molten rock. It is deadly fire. We see what's left over after it covers the earth with black, ugly, burned up rock. Go to Hawaii if you can. And I do recommend it. It's a beautiful place. But the big island there, it's got lots of lava fields and lots of active lava. I mean, will he destroy it from the fires that are deeply buried in the earth? The very fountains of the deep that he opened to separate the world into multiple continents, or I should say the dry land into multiple continents? I don't know. Is there value in thinking about things like this? I cannot say that there is, because I cannot tell you specifics about that firmament. But I'll guarantee you this. If it still existed, we'd know about it. We would know about water that was out there separated by some gap, that there was a firmament below the water and a firmament above the water, and that there were waters above water separated by... We'd see that. We'd have some knowledge of it. Most people read that. They just blow right on past it. I know I have. But we shouldn't, in my opinion. And particularly we see absences, when we see anomalies like all the days were good, declared so by God, except this one. That's worth thinking about. I know that's not the gospel, but it's what's presented here in chapter 1 and the verses that I read. God bless you, and hope to be able to preach to you next week. Goodbye.
Okay. You just heard the words of